Hello Church, this is going to be our second blog for this week, and as I was preparing for this blog I was reminded of a book that I read when I was a fairly new Christian. Often on my break when I was a chef, I'd have a 3-hour break on a split shift, and I'd sit in the restaurant with this book, and just remember having a huge impact on me. It was written by Melody Green about her husband Keith Green and their ministry, and it was called No Compromise. And just listen to this quote. I felt it was really significant for where we're at the moment. It says, when church is over and there's no one there to listen except the only one who matters, do you still have that same passionate joy in your spirit just to be alone with the living God? At the moment, church as we know it has kind of come to an end. We're unable to gather together in the church building. But when we're alone with Jesus, the same passion that we have to worship him together should be upon our hearts, in our homes. In the quiet place, when we're alone with God, does your heart sing with joy to worship him? I was looking at these words from Keith Green, and at the same time God was drawing my attention to the story of Daniel, a story where him and his friends have been taken out of their land and have been placed into exile in a foreign land with a foreign king and foreign gods. And King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon builds this huge statue and says when the music starts playing, everyone must come and bow down and worship this statue. And yet Daniel and his friends refuse to do so. They refused to do so. Why? Because their God, Yahweh, was the only God who, as far as they were concerned. That's true. We believe that Jesus is the only true living God, that there's no other way to the Father except through him. And that no one else deserves our worship but him alone. And Daniel and his friends see God and God alone as worthy of their worship and nothing else. They will not bow down to this idol. And yet the consequence of that is that the king says he will throw anyone who does not into a fiery furnace where they will be consumed. This fiery furnace was 7 times hotter than the normal fire that actually we read in the story that those preparing the fire were consumed, just preparing it, let alone being thrown in it. And yet Daniel and his friends, in faith and trust in the Lord their God, was prepared not to bow down and worship this idol, even if it meant they were thrown into the fire, because they completely trust that even if they were thrown into this fire and consumed, that God was for them, not against them, and that the worst case scenario is they get to go and be with the Lord their God. But they believed that the Lord their God would be with them and would carry them through. And we hear in the story that they see a fourth figure in the fire. This fourth figure, their God, Jesus. And they come out the fire untouched. Now, why am I sharing this story with you? Why am I sharing this quote with you? Well, in the midst of us not gathering together, it's very easy sometimes to sway away from God. As I was saying in my last post, we can sort of fall off the guided path that the shepherd leads us on. And we can fall into fear and we can fall into anxiety. The God that we're being called to bow down and worship at the moment is one of fear. And yet, we read throughout the Bible time and time and time again, God saying to his people, fear not. As a matter of fact, we're told in Proverbs that the only one we should fear, and it's true wisdom, is to fear the Lord your God. It's the very beginning of wisdom. To fear God above all others, that he alone is God and worthy of our praise. You might feel like you're going through a bit of a fire at the moment. But I truly believe that for these friends of Daniel who were in the fire, that actually whilst they're in the fire, that everything else that was other than their worship of God would have been burnt up, and they came out refined with fresh faith and fresh belief, a fresh vision of who their God was, a greater measure. That through this fire that we might find ourselves going through, do we truly believe that God is doing a great work, burning up the things that he does not want in our life, so that our gaze might be fixed on him and him alone, and that we might have a greater perspective of who he is as the Lord our God. In these days, I really believe that God is calling us into a place where we might get rid of those things that distract us, that draw us away from him. Another quote that we read from Keith Green's book is this. Just listen to this. It says this. If your hearts take more pleasure in reading novels or watching TV or going to the movies or talking to friends rather than just sitting alone with God and embracing him, sharing his cares and his burdens, weeping and rejoicing with him, then how are you going to handle forever and ever in his presence? You'll be bored to tears in heaven if you're not ecstatic about God now. Are you ecstatic about God right now? In the midst of your burdens and your challenges, sometimes perhaps feel like you're going through the fire, are you ecstatic about God right now, about what he wants to do in and through us during this time? Are you prepared to come before him and bring those things to him, trusting that actually he can burn those things away that distract us from him and enable us to be able to see him for the good, big God that he is? That he's faithful, that he's good, and that he's perfect. And that he promises to be with you through your fire. A picture that a friend shared with me many years ago was of the process that a sword or metal takes to be shaped into a sword. Don't know if you know, but the metal is completely melted down, and then it's shaped, battered over an anvil with a hammer, and then it's plunged back into the fire, and it goes through this process time and time again, but eventually it's then plunged into a pool of cold water, and this glorious, shiny, sharp object comes out. I really believe that if you feel you're going through a fire at the moment, that's a picture God wants you to hold. That yes, it's painful. Yes, it feels like we're being burnt and almost over an anvil being beaten. But the true thing is that God is shaping us and molding us and fashioning us into something that would honor him, that would be beautiful and radiant, something that he can place in his hand and use for his glory. I encourage you this day, if you feel you're going through the fire, embrace it and know that God is with you in it, and ask him to refine you and to give you a bigger gaze of who he is in this day, just as we see with Daniel and his friends. What we see later on in the story is that these men who kept their gaze fixed on God in tough times, in challenging times, that actually they were put into places of influence. Daniel himself was put into a place of influence. What might God be doing in these days through us, and how might he use us for his glory? I just wonder. But let's keep our gaze fixed on him. Even through the fire, we can be rejoicing. Even through the fire, we can be celebrating that God is doing a good work in and through his church. So be encouraged this day in all that you do, and celebrate with God all that he might want to do in and through you. Be blessed and have a great day. And we look forward to seeing you Sunday for Virtual Church.